And now on Book TV, Amitabh Pal looks at the history of nonviolence in Muslim societies around the world and argues that while violent acts by Muslims get covered widely in the media, nonviolent movements exist everywhere and deserve just as much recognition. This is about an hour and 20 minutes.
Hi, I'd like to welcome you all to Rainbow. We're a cooperatively owned and managed bookstore, and we've been around for over 20 years now, and we're located on West Gilman at 426, just off of State Street, so please come by. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Amitabh Pal. He is managing editor at the Progressive magazine and co-editor of the Progressive Media Project. He has interviewed several eminent personalities for the magazine, including Jimmy Carter, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the Dalai Lama. And today, he will be discussing his recent book, Islam Means Peace, Understanding the Muslim Principle of Nonviolence Today. So, without further ado, Amitabh Pal.
Thanks, Colin. And I'd like to start off with something that happened just today. And this is something that is so pertinent to my book and the theme of the book and what we'll be speaking about. Mark Anthony Stroman was executed by the state of Texas. How does that pertain to what I'll be talking about? He actually, in the aftermath of September 11th, he went around looking for Arabs to kill as revenge for September 11th, managed instead to kill somebody from India, somebody from Pakistan, and gravely wounded a Bangladeshi immigrant, Raz Bhuiyan. Raz Bhuiyan describes to the New York Times what happened to him. There were 38 pellets in my face. I couldn't open my eyes or talk or open my jaw. I couldn't even eat or drink anything. My face was heavily swollen. There were gunshot wounds. My face was horrible. I couldn't believe it was happening. I prayed, please God, give my face back. The Times adds, Mr. Bhuiyan was discharged the day after being treated. He was told he did not have health insurance. Over the next several months, he slept on people's couches and had to rely on physician samples for medication, including painkillers and eye drops. How does all this pertain to the theme of my book, Islam Means Peace? Believe it or not, Raz Bhuiyan was in the forefront of trying to get Mr. Stroman clemency from the death penalty. When asked why, he said, I was raised very well by my parents and teachers. They raised me with good morals and strong faith. They taught me to put yourself in others' shoes. Even if they hurt you, don't take revenge. Forgive them, move on. It'll bring something good to you and them. My Islamic faith teaches me this too. Stroman said he did this as an act of war, and a lot of Americans wanted to do it, but he had the courage to do it, to shoot Muslims. I decided that forgiveness was not enough, that what he did was out of ignorance. I decided I had to do something to save this person's life. Unfortunately, his efforts were in vain, in a way, and Mark Stroman was put to death by the state of Texas just today itself, but not completely in vain. Mr. Stroman was an avowed white supremacist who took pride for a long time in what he did. In the end, though, Raz Bhuiyan's deeds, his actions in trying to get him clemency, completely changed his mind. And he said, in the free world I was free, but I was locked in a prison inside myself because of the hate I carried in my heart. This has really touched my heart, what Mr. Bhuiyan did, and the heart of many others worldwide, especially since for the last 10 years, all we have heard about is how evil the Islamic faith can be. This is proof that all are not bad or evil. He's a survivor of my hate. His deep Islamic beliefs gave him the strength to forgive the unforgivable, and is truly inspiring to me, and should be an example for us all. And from here I go back to the title of my book, which is derived from a quotation by Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi, many decades ago. So you can see Mahatma Gandhi back in the 1920s, 30s, and Ras Bhuiyan, they're operating on the same principle. It's quite remarkable, and I couldn't have hoped for a better example, to illustrate the theme of my book. And Gandhi says, my reading of the Quran has convinced me that the basis of Islam is not violence, but is unadulterated peace, because it regards forbearance as superior to vengeance, which is exactly the same principle, in spite of suffering so much, that Ras Bhuiyan was operating on also. And in spite of being disabled and so badly hurt, it's quite remarkable that he took the step of trying to get his possible killer and somebody who wounded him so badly clemency. This is quite a remarkable moment to be talking about what I'm talking about, because just 2 months away, we are just 2 months away from the killing of Osama bin Laden. Hopefully, if not the ending of Al-Qaeda, then at least the debilitating of Al-Qaeda. They have a new leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri. But I would hope that his passing away is both literal and symbolic. And at the same time, it's such an exciting time to be in, because 2011 has been an incredibly momentous year for the exact opposite of the philosophy that Osama bin Laden was espousing, and that is pacifism and non-violence. If I was speaking with you even late last year about pacifism in the Muslim world, I would have to explain myself. Perhaps some of you would remember the Green Movement in Iran 2 years ago. That did get some coverage, not as much as it should have perhaps, but at least some coverage. But no other example that I have listed in my book, ranging from very recent instances, Pakistan 2007, 2008, mass movement overthrew Pervez Musharraf, the general who had ruled there for many years. Maldives, a small island nation, longest serving dictator in Asia, was overthrown. Back a few years ago, the Balkans. Further back, Muslim Gandhians. None of these are known in the West. Iran was the only partial exception. But now when I speak with people and tell them about mass peaceful protest in the Muslim world, I don't get sort of quizzical faces and blank looks, because the last 6 to 8 months have been truly momentous. I think it may be the most momentous year in modern Arab history, and one of the most, perhaps, in global history, at least since World War II. December 2008, one man, and I'll get back to him and talk about him, Mohammad Bouazizi, lit himself as an act of protest. That act has set off this remarkable chain of events where there is almost not a single country untouched by mass protest, from Morocco all the way to the border of Pakistan, Iran. So it's the Arab world plus Iran. Almost all these countries have been shaken by protest. In 2 countries, protesters have managed to get success, Tunisia and Egypt. And as I said, I'll talk more about this as we go on. In other countries, I know it's still in flux, but I advise people not to be impatient. Let's wait. And I'm confident in at least a couple of other countries, Bahrain, for example, Syria maybe, that there will be positive change. It's still 6 to 8 months. Let's remember, it took Gandhi 30 plus years after he came back to India. It took Martin Luther King a decade. I think in this day and age, we have sort of, very limited attention spans, and we should give people more time. It's not even been a year. So we should definitely be patient. So the theme of my book is, Islam and non-violence, Islam and pacifism. I caution people and tell them, they say, what about Al-Qaeda? What about, the Taliban? I am not saying there is an absence of violence in Islam. What I'm saying is, please do not be reductive. What I'm saying is, there is at the same time a strand of non-violence, a strand of pacifism that can be seized upon, that can be used by people interested in engaging in mass peaceful protest. And they have, as I show in my book again and again, back in the 1940s, 1930s, again in the 1970s, again in the 1980s and 90s, and now, of course, the Green Movement and Tunisia, Egypt, and other countries in the Arab world. What's happening in the Middle East has changed people's minds about the Arab world and about Islam, but unfortunately not enough. And that's the reason I think that, if I may be a bit less humble, that the book is needed. A recent statistic was the one that distressed me the most. March 2011, so after Tunisia and Egypt started, a poll asked Americans what they think of American Muslims. Nearly 3 in 10, 28%, said that Americans are sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. Now that to me is a very distressing number. I mean, you can argue that American Muslims are more devout, maybe fundamentalist, if you want to use a loaded word, doctrinaire. But to say that 3 out of 10 Americans think that American Muslims are sympathetic to the possibly the worst terrorist organization in the world is something that is indeed quite appalling, I think, and something that needs to be challenged and refuted. And the sad thing is that this is based on complete ignorance. And the evidence, a 2010 September 2010 Pew Forum survey finds that only half of Americans know that the Quran is the holy book of Muslims. Now that is quite astounding, that you would form an opinion in the absence of this central sort of knowledge that, I mean, there's nothing more central to Islam than the Quran. And to not know that and yet have such strong opinions about Muslims is quite remarkable to me. Also, only 1/3, this may be less astounding given the lack of geographical information that a lot of people have in this country. But 1/3 of Americans, only 1/3 knew that Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country. Now, there is a problem there beyond the ignorance of Indonesia. What happens is, and this is, I think, a reason for the misperceptions about Islam, that Americans generally feel that Islam is Middle Eastern Islam, and Middle Eastern Islam is Saudi Islam, not knowing that Arab Muslims are just between 1/4 and 1/5 of the total, that the largest concentration of Muslims are in South Asia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and in Indonesia. So I think there is a problem there. So I would like to start with the sources of Islam, then give a bit of the history of Islam, and then move on from there quickly to actual instances of, which is what I think is important. Otherwise, we can keep on quoting and counter-quoting from the Quran. We can keep on sort of, citing and counter-citing from history. What instead matters is the practice of a certain religion. And if I may say so, and I'm not making an invidious comparison, so in practice today, Islam was much more forgiving than the Christianity of Texas Governor Rick Perry. Really. I mean, so it was the state of Texas which executed, Sturman, and it refused to forgive him in spite of the pleas of one of his victims. So it's practice that matters, I think, in the end. And so I would like to start with the sources of the Quran. And the main source, of course, is the holy book of the Quran. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, the Quran. And we can keep on, as I said, citing and counter-citing from the Quran, but there's enough in there, as you'll see in this, which can be easily seized upon and used by anyone who wishes to follow the path of tolerance, non-violence, reconciliation. The most famous quote in the Quran dealing with compulsion and religion is the second from the bottom. There is no compulsion in the name of religion. Right and wrong have become distinct. Those who wish so may believe, and those who may wish otherwise may disbelieve. There are several other quotes like this in the Quran. There is, for example, fight in the way of God those who fight you, but do not begin hostilities. God does not like the aggressor. Then there is, God forbids you to fight those who fight not your faith and who do not drive you out. Be just and kind to them, for God loves the just. So, there are enough passages that I came across in the Quran itself that sort of, enjoin people to be nice, to be kind, and not only toward Muslims, but toward all people. And of course, there is the concept of the people of the book in the Quran, which includes Christians and Jews, and Muslims also sort of, they believe in the Old Testament. So there is this interfaith notion in Islam. Now, whether, Muslims follow it in their daily practice depends, of course, from individual to individual. There is a renowned comparative religion scholar, Karen Armstrong, and I love the quote that she has. The Quran is adamantly opposed to the use of force in religious matters. Its vision is inclusive. It recognizes the validity of all rightly guided religion and praises all the great prophets of the past. She's an ex-nun. I would recommend that you all look at her stuff. She's written a book on Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, comparative books, I mean, just incredible stuff, basically. There's a lot of, mercy and forbearance are two qualities that are so commonly mentioned in the Quran, for example. The unity of mankind is something else that's mentioned very commonly. The Quran, again and again, asks the Prophet Muhammad not to exert pressure in the name of religion. It urges Muslims not to refuse any proposal for peace. One can go on and on, basically, and there are, as I said, if you read my book, I cite instances again and again. And as these scholars, there's a whole range. There's Karen Armstrong, who's an ex-nun. There's an American professor who deals with this notion that a lot of people have, that the later verses of the Quran abrogate, chronologically, abrogate the earlier ones, which are much more peaceful. And he says, look, that's just an interpretation. It's Professor Firestone, Asghar Ali, engineer, Quran translator, Abdullah Yusuf Ali. All of these basically, point out that the Quran can be interpreted in a very peaceful, very pluralistic way. From there, we go to the life and conduct of the Prophet Muhammad. Now here, the Prophet Muhammad is very unique because unlike the Buddha, or unlike Jesus, more like, I guess, the Hindu demigods, he was a fighter and a religious leader at the same time. So here, that leads to a certain construction in the minds of Westerners that he was so much more belligerent and warlike than Jesus or the Buddha. But if we examine his life, a lot of scholars have pointed out a number of very salient things. Number one, for 13 long years, now 13 years ago I was quite a young man, now I'm middle-aged, it's a long span of time, a decade and a half almost. 13 long years he was in Mecca, and there were humiliations and atrocities inflicted upon him and his followers, and for that entire span of time he refused to fight back. And there are wonderful quotations from that time period where he's sort of asking God to sort of to give him strength and to forgive his tormentors. For 13 long years he was in Mecca, which is why the Meccan verses are so much more avowedly peaceful. And then after 13 years or so, there was this one central act that's hallowed in Islam, and that's a non-violent act, which is he left with his followers from Mecca to Medina, which is the Hijrah, basically. And that's the central, it's one of the most hallowed acts in the history of Islam. Then it gets more complicated. Once he was in Medina, he did raise an army and defend himself. Now, however, scholars point out that his conduct was defensive. And for example, Karen Armstrong, there is Rafiq Zakaria, who's an Indian scholar. He says it's clear in every case involving violence the Prophet Muhammad acted under provocation. His general attitude was that of reconciliation. He did not approve of aggression because the Quran has warned the faithful that God does not love the aggressors. So, in every instance, pretty much violence was forced upon him. When he returned to Mecca, he sort of forgave everybody there in spite of the fact they were fighting him. And, generally he signed a number of peace treaties, and he was very adept at bringing about reconciliation between the various tribes on the Saudi Peninsula. So to think of him as a warlike figure is a misconception. And I'll get to the Sufis later on, the Sufi Muslims. They especially think of him as a central figure of peace and love. And their conception is even more pacifist of him. So we basically now turn to from the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad to the history of Islam, which has also been very problematized in the West. And Zachary Karabel, wonderful book out called Peace Be Upon You. He says that scholars have long ago disposed of the image of Islam being spread by the sword, but that has not altered popular imagination. I think the problem became that the West came into conflict with Islam, Europe, of course, famously, in a way it hasn't with any other world religion. And because of that, these stereotypes of Islam came up, which persist till date. And if you look at the actual history of Islam, it's quite different. And for example, let us take South Asia, which is where I'm from. Now, even in South Asia, there is this misconception that Islam was spread by the sword. Not so. The largest concentration of Muslims in South Asia is in Bangladesh, current Bangladesh, and Indian Bengal. Over there, Sufi saints went about spreading it, the religion, as the forests were being cleared. Another big concentration is in current day Pakistan, of course, Pakistani Punjab. Again, Sufi saints went about spreading Islam there. Let's come to Kerala, which is a state in the southwest of India, which has about 25% Muslims, the highest number of Muslims in India proper. Again, it was Arab traders who came there and spread Islam. Kerala is actually quite remarkable in the level of human development it has, way ahead of any other part of India. Let's go to Indonesia, Sufi saints. Africa, it was mainly merchants. Now let's get to the Arab world. Over there, it was trickier, I must admit. So the Arabs did conquer a large portion of the Middle East in a remarkable span of time. There is no denying that. However, scholars point out that the empires they defeated were already completely decaying. It was the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. These two were the main ones they defeated. They were already decaying from within, atrophying. It was very easy for the Arabs to defeat them. And this may sound totally weird, but in Egypt, for example, many of the bishops actually collaborated with the invaders against their own overlords. They were so dissatisfied. So there was that going on also. Most importantly, and I think this is something that should really be pointed out, it took a couple of centuries for these places to become Muslim. It was a long, slow process. It wasn't that these guys came, said, you have to convert, otherwise you die. In fact, a lot of these Arab invaders, because of snobbishness about they being from where they were, did not actually care for sort of, converting the indigenous populations. So, for example, Richard Eaton says, this is what helped make the process of conversion so smooth. The Muslims shared animal sacrifice with pagans and Zoroastrians, and ritual slaughter with Jews, shared circumcision with Jews and Christians, institutionalized charity like Jews and Christians, covered their heads during worship like Jews, their month-long fast followed by a festival like many other groups, they practiced ritual ablutions as the Zoroastrians, and the ritual prayer resembled that of Nestorian Christians. All these continuities help make the conversion so much smoother. And actually, it took 2 centuries or 3 centuries for these places to become Muslim, from the 8th to 9th to 10th century. rather than, this way, which is what would have happened if you had thought that, it happened the way that a lot of people think it happened. So the Arab Empire was established. After the Arabs, of course, the major empire in the area was the Ottoman Empire. And here's a French philosopher paying tribute to the Ottomans, saying that the Ottoman emperor permits every man to live according to his conscience and suffers 4 diverse religions: the Jews, Christians, Greeks, and Mohammedans, which is what they used to call the Muslims back in the 17th, 18th century. And the Ottoman Empire was remarkably pluralistic and tolerant until the very end. And of course, the slaughter of the Armenians at the end is a huge black mark. That, however, was much more of an expression of Turkish nationalism rather than Islamic fundamentalism. Happened at the very end. It was a terrible, terrible episode in history, but that should not negate the centuries preceding, when they ruled, for example, Greece, which is still completely Christian, Cyprus, which is mostly Christian, and even in other places, the notion was not to sort of convert people just by hook or by crook. And as I said, in a lot of these places, instead of at the point of a sword, Islam was spread by Sufi saints. And the Sufi Muslims are really interesting. In the West's imagination, again, they are either thought of as extraneous to Islam or as some far-out hippie cult almost, which has no resonance within Islam at all. And both these ideas are off the mark. They're not extraneous to Islam. The central figure for the Sufis is again the Prophet Muhammad, who they think of as embodying and exemplifying love and peace. They are very much within Islam. As for their impact in Islam, this is tricky. Now, formally, people don't identify themselves as Sufi Muslims. It's either Sunni or Shiite. However, Sufi practices are so prevalent. Go to any place in the Indian subcontinent. Go to Indonesia. You have these, for example, these in the Indian subcontinent, these dargahs of Sufi saints where Hindus and Muslims go all the time to offer prayers. The intercession of saints is very much from Sufi Islam. And these are 2 early Sufi saints, Rabia al-Adawiyya, woman no less, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, who basically had women in his inner circle. So they were very way ahead of the Christian church, or I would say of nearly any other society at the time, in integrating women. And the Sufi idea of peace, as I say, is rooted in the concept of Tawheed, which is the unity of all mankind, not just all Muslims, but all mankind. So peace, the unity of all mankind, is something that they have preached forever. Their notion of love and heart is so expansive that according to some Sufis, the heart has 5-6 chambers. Each chamber is representing something. They have this really complex delineation of the heart, which is really very interesting actually. Not all Sufis have been peaceful. There have been militant Sufis. They have been written about. But generally the record of Sufis, for example, in South Asia has been remarkably positive. He who is not my friend, may God be his friend. He who causes me distress, may his joy increase. He who places thorns in my path with malice in his heart, may every flower that blooms in the garden of his life be without a single thorn. It's a Sufi saint, Sheikh Abu Sa'id Abul Khair, Nizamuddin Aulia used to recite this. Nizamuddin Aulia's tomb is in New Delhi, in Delhi, and is still one of the most visited shrines in northern India. That Sufism was just a minor cult with no influence on rulers or emperors is something that can be negated by these two. Akbar, of course all South Asians know him. I don't know how many non-South Asians know about him. Remarkable emperor. Was there in India in the 16th century or so. Amazingly pluralistic for his time. Was heavily under the influence of Sufis. There's been a cheesy Bollywood movie made recently on him. I'm not sure if I should recommend that for you all to sit through, but you can get some idea of him from that. For example, there have been novels etc. written about him too. and is held in such high esteem in current day India that, for example, the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, etc., think of him as a role model for all posterity, that there hasn't been an emperor this remarkable as Akbar. In the end, he tried to fashion a religion, Deen-e-Ilahi, which he thought would combine the best elements of all religions. Didn't outlive him, but it was quite an incredible sort of venture that he undertook. The one below him is his great-grandson, Dara Shikoh. Unfortunately with him, the story doesn't quite end as well as that for Akbar. Incredible scholar, heavily influenced by Sufism, had Sufi gurus or teachers, wrote poetry, wrote an incredible book called Majma-ul-Bahrain, which is the confluence of two oceans, the two oceans being Islam and Hinduism. Unfortunately, I think, in that day and age, it was perhaps not entirely a good thing for a prince to be that scholarly, and he was so immersed in all this that his brother Aurangzeb took advantage and basically defeated him and killed him. So he was the eldest son, should have been the rightful emperor, wasn't, but the efforts that he undertook on the behalf of pluralism, they're still remembered in South Asia. Aurangzeb himself, his sister Jahan Ara and daughter Zebonisa were also Sufi mystics, and I think he tolerated, those were the only two Sufis he probably tolerated. He let them somehow function, and I've heard his sister was the only one in the kingdom who could answer him back and not pay for it with her life. So Akbar and Dara Shikoh are two remarkable examples from Asian history, about which show us the influence of Sufism in South Asia especially, but on rulers generally. Several Sufi saints are still incredibly revered in South Asia. One of them, Sai Baba, is so revered by Hindus and Muslims. My mother has been there. I'm Hindu by background, a number of times to his shrine. Jalaluddin Rumi is known in the West as an incredible Sufi mystic and poet. Mirza Ghulam Ahmad I'll come to a bit later. Slightly different background, so I'll deal with him a bit later. Yes. If you desire union with God, make peace with all and sundry. Say Allah, Allah to Muslims and Ram, Ram to Brahmins. So this notion of interfaith understanding, interfaith tolerance was just remarkable. The Sufi saints made highly significant and enduring contributions to the evolution and development of India's composite, syncretic legacy of civilization. Through the message of love, compassion, tolerance, kindness and service to mankind, by building bridges of understanding, amity and harmony between Hindus and Muslims and among various ethnic groups. I just got these photographs from Himal, which is a great publication dealing with South Asia. Sufism in Kashmir. In the region of Kashmir, which sadly is better known today for this insurgency going on in the Indian portion of Kashmir, Islam was spread by Sufi saints who were so remarkably pluralistic. The main saint is known as Nuruddin Rishi among Hindus and Nuruddin Nurani among Muslims, the same person. Rishi means is the Hindi or Hindu word for saint, and these were the people who spread Islam in Kashmir. Amazingly remarkable. We belong to the same parents. Why the difference? That Hindus and Muslims together worship God. We came to the world like partners. We should share our joys and sorrows together. This is not the festival in the honor of Nuruddin, but another Kashmiri saint called Zainuddin in Kashmir, and you can see, it's his death anniversary, what's called Urs, and also the festival of spring, and Kashmiri is offering prayer there. And to date, Sufism still has resonance there. Sufism is true Islam. Sufism is the path of love. For militant Islamists, love is a hated word. In the place of love for all, which the Sufis have taught, they insist that we should hate all those who disagree with us. I think they are the greatest enemies of our faith. A Kashmiri student is saying this. So Sufism still has resonance. Some of the militant groups have tried to impose a much more fundamentalist, rigid version of Islam. There has been pushback from the Kashmiri population against this. We come then to another Muslim sect called the Ahmadiyyas, and here I'm delving into controversial territory. This is Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. The reason I would like to deal with them is that they gave the most avowedly pacifist interpretation to the Quran of any Muslims possible. Why are they controversial? Because Mirza Ghulam Ahmad said that the Quran completely eschews violence, that we should go on the pacifist path, there is no need for violence at all. The reason he said this though is he said that he was the second coming of Christ. And that has made him very controversial. The Ahmadiyyas very controversial among other Muslims. However, in India, in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, they are still recognized as Muslims. In Pakistan, they are not. In the Arab world, they do not exist that I could find in my research in large enough communities to be visible, but they do exist in South Asia, Southeast Asia. They claim to be in the millions. It's hard to know. They have a presence here in the US, historically, among African Americans and among current day immigrants. There are Ahmadiyya organizations and places of worship. And as I said, you know, they are the most avowedly pacifist sect possible. The reason that they become controversial is that, as I said, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad declared himself to be the second coming of Christ, which made them heretical in the eyes of a lot of Muslims. But I have dealt with them in a couple of pages because I think they're important, and it's important for people to know about them, whether or not you agree or disagree with their doctrine. Now, my South Asian friends can't answer this question. This is only open to people not from South Asia. How many of these four can people recognize? My South Asian friends will be, even they may not be able to recognize one, may or may not be able to, but can people recognize any of the, other people recognize any of the four? So the first one is Salman Ahmad, a band called Junoon from Pakistan, currently resides in Queens, teaches at Queens College. I had the pleasure to actually interview him last year. Completely, his music, his philosophy, his life completely impacted and imbued with Sufism. Quotes from Sufi saints all the time in his music, in his lyrics, is heavily influenced and inspired by them. Incredible person, has tried to build bridges between India and Pakistan, Islam and the West again and again. I have a piece on him which is available online in the magazine. Really interesting person. Divides his time now between Pakistan and the US. Huge following in South Asia and among the diaspora. Says, why Sufism attracts me is that it is a search for knowledge, seeking who you are. The whole message of Sufi mystics was knowing yourself, and through knowing yourself, knowing God. When you really see with the heart and connect with God, love for humanity comes automatically. Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan is the one right at the bottom. He died in the late 90s, and again, another person, Sufism had a huge impact on him and his life and his music. The person above him, the person between Salman Ahmad and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, can anyone recognize? Again, not those from South Asia. Yeah.
This is a musician from South India?
Yes, from South India, A.R. Rahman. Best known in the West for Slumdog. Incredible person again. Really interesting life story. Converted to Islam himself. Father was of Hindu background, and again somebody who is really drawn to Sufism. He says, in Sufism there's no distinction between Hindu and Muslim. They just look straight into your heart, see your love for the Sufi saints and the Noor, the light of the Prophet. And he says, love can transcend all these issues. You need to find a larger perspective which bridges all these worlds, West and East, Muslim and non-Muslim, or whatever else divides us. The gentleman in the African dress, lower corner, is Youssou N'Dour, another giant of global music. From Senegal, again, somebody who's heavily influenced by Sufism, has done a Sufi album called Egypt, which won a Grammy. And again, says, Islam for me is a religion of peace and tolerance, and I'd like people to understand my life's work better, my music, and especially what Islam means to me, which is why he did that album. Incredible person, you should listen to his stuff too. Absolutely amazing. So Sufism still, as can be seen by these incredible and incredibly famous musicians from South Asia and from Africa, still has an amazing resonance. I'll get quickly into, and I don't want to sort of give short shrift to this aspect of Islam, and something I had to deal with and I deal with, which is jihad. Now, what is jihad? Jihad is actually not war, it is not murder, it is, the literal translation is struggle. And struggle, jihad-e-akbar, the greatest struggle is within yourself. Jihad-e-asghar, the lesser struggle, is the struggle to defend Islam. As shown in my book, you can get into the details. I don't want to sort of, go really deep into this right now, that even for the defense of Islam, there are really clear rules delineated, and you can't, for example, attack by stealth. You can't attack civilians. Needless to say, the conduct of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban have been completely in contradiction to all these rules laid down. Whether jihad is a defensive or an offensive doctrine is something, of course, that's debatable, but I come down on the side of, as do a lot of Muslim scholars, that's meant to be a defensive doctrine at the very best, to be waged in the defense of Islam as a last resort with clear rules laid down. And as scholar Tamara Son says about jihad and says about terrorism, she says that it is difficult to find support for the use of irregular or terrorist tactics in the Islamic tradition. Both are condemned under the rubric of Islam's general reticence concerning revolution, because of its respect for life and its insistence that God has exclusive rights in judging the piety of believers. You can find all this in the book. I want to move on to sort of real life examples, but there's a chapter in my book, I gloss over it or completely skip over that aspect of Islam, because I really thought that had to be dealt with, because that's the aspect of Islam that comes up often enough, if not very often, in the discourse about Islam in the West. We move on to real life examples. Can anyone, again, not from South Asia perhaps, identify the people in this photograph? So there is Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, walking. There is Patel, who was India's first Deputy Prime Minister, sitting in that rickshaw. And there is this tall man with a long nose, a long beak-like nose, walking alongside him. Perhaps no one knows who he is, which is the tragedy. Now here, people know the other person, I'm sure. You don't have to be from South Asia. Remarkable photo, isn't it? Just a remarkable, remarkable photo. One can almost see an aura around the other man. I mean, it's just an amazing picture. He's so much at peace with himself. Who is he, though? Badshah Khan, yeah. So it's Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. An amazing picture, an amazing man, an amazing movement. Comes out of a fairy tale. The same region which gave birth to the Taliban gave birth to Ghaffar Khan and a movement of 100,000 Pashtuns who were dedicated to non-violence, religious tolerance, gender rights, and social equity. Just an amazing, amazing example that seems almost made up, but it wasn't. And the second thing was that he took all his inspiration from Islam. And scholars have said that if Gandhi was the more successful practitioner of non-violence at the personal level, Khan outdid him at the social level. That, it was remarkable for a number of reasons. The British cracked down on the Pashtuns in a way they never did on Gandhi's followers in the rest of India for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was easy because there was hardly any media in those frontier regions. Number two, they were so full of their own stereotypes, they never could believe that the Pashtuns could go in for non-violence. It was all a ruse. So they killed them en masse. I mean, it is just absolutely remarkable, the amount of violence they did upon them. 300 people killed in a single day, for example. A number of instances like this. People just being gunned down, Pashtuns coming, lifting up those bodies and coming to the front lines again, not fighting back, not engaging in violence. I mean, just remarkable examples. And Khan said that, I cite a chapter and verse from the Quran to show the great emphasis that Islam has laid on peace, which is its coping stone. I also showed to somebody he was having a debate with that the greatest figures in Islamic history were known more for their forbearance and self-restraint than for their fierceness. The reply rendered him speechless, the person he was debating with. Even after the Prophet's exodus from Mecca into Medina, his opponents did not leave him in peace. This is Khan. They sent after him a big force to annihilate him. He tried hard to avert a clash, but in vain. It was only when he was attacked that he took up arms in self-defense. In Islam, that man is considered to be worthy of the highest praise, who leads a good life, keeps close to God, and does not return a blow for blow or evil for evil. If a man is slapped in the face and forgives the injury, he is generous. He is a great and good man, worthy of the highest praise. Remarkable person, remarkable life, remarkable example. Why is he not at all known in the West? A number of reasons. Unlike Gandhi, he left behind very little in terms of his writings, etc. There's just one autobiography that he dictated back in the 1960s. Another is he was a Pashtun nationalist, a non-violent Pashtun nationalist, but a Pashtun nationalist nevertheless. Came into conflict with the Pakistani government, had to go to jail again, spent 15 years in jail under the British, and 15 years in jail under the Pakistani government. So as a result, in Pakistan also he's been erased from history. In India, he's been belittled. His nickname is the Frontier Gandhi. So the idea is that he took his inspiration from the Mahatma. Not so. He himself again and again said it was from Prophet Muhammad, from the Quran. As he said, there's nothing surprising in a Muslim or a Pashtun like me subscribing to the creed of non-violence. It is not a new creed. It was followed 1400 years ago by the Prophet all the time when he was in Mecca. And a member of his group, the servants of God, told an interviewer, we did not follow non-violence because Gandhi told us. We followed it because in Islam, our Prophet said that violence does not solve anything. As I said, an absolutely remarkable person. There's a new documentary out by none other than Marshall McLuhan, the great media theorist, his daughter. She contacted me 8 or 10 years ago when she was starting that documentary. I've heard at great personal peril she's made the movie. It's not even available for purchase the last time I checked. I would urge everybody to see it. I'll try to get a copy myself. There are biographies of him available by Raj Mohan Gandhi, Gandhi's grandson, and other people, but again, not a single one written by a Western author. He's been almost forgotten. Died in 1988 at the age of 98. That's when I heard about him, and the first time I heard about this remarkable movement in the northwest region of Pakistan. Another chapter I've dedicated to people like these. Again, unknown in the West, very well known in South Asia. Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, a theologian no less, an associate of Gandhi, somebody who was dedicated to the same principles as Gandhi of non-violence, pluralism, religious harmony, became India's first education minister and stayed in that post, and to date he's revered in India as a major figure in the Indian independence movement. Zakir Hussain, another remarkable person, educationist, somebody who again drew inspiration from non-violence, religious pluralism, religious tolerance, was a progressive educationist, not just an educationist, became a president of India. Now I must clarify here that the presidency in India has much less powers than the presidency in the United States. But still, he did become the president of India, the third president of India, attained that post, which shows the respect that he was held in by Indians, and is less well known today than Maulana Azad, but people still do remember him because he became the president. Several other people who were with Gandhi, another person who was a foot soldier, so to speak, in the Indian independence movement, became again a president of India, Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad, in the 1970s. Gandhi himself was influenced, believe it or not, by Islam. He cited Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, as a role model. He cited his attempts to build an ideal society as a role model, cited the martyrdom of Hassan and Hussein, which is in Shiite Islam, as role models. And it's interesting, I found an Iraqi member of parliament citing Gandhi, citing Hassan and Hussein. I don't know how that Iraqi member of parliament came to know about this, but remarkable story. From the 1930s and 40s, we come to the 1990s and much more recent examples. Does anyone know who, well, it's written out there, Gandhi of the Balkans, but does anyone know about him at all? The Balkans. He was in Kosovar, Albania, built a remarkable movement that lasted for almost a decade of a parallel society of civil disobedience, mass civil disobedience, mass boycott of Serb institutions. Let me explain. Kosovo is/was a part of Serbia/Yugoslavia. It's so complicated. So Yugoslavia was there, within Yugoslavia was Serbia, within Serbia was Kosovo. Kosovo wanted to be at least autonomous, if not independent. Milosevic, who many of you may know, cracked down very heavily. In response, Ibrahim Rugova and the Kosovar Albanians built this remarkable parallel society of schools, colleges, hospitals, and very pluralistic. Named, for example, one of the main institutions was named the Mother Teresa Association. Worked together with Christians and defied Milosevic for the better part of a decade. Unfortunately, the West ignored him. Also, unfortunately, he did not achieve the full potential of what such a campaign should have been able to achieve. Was too passive, was not active enough in reaching out and trying to convince his opponents. In the end, it became stasis. And as a result, a guerrilla movement sprang up, NATO intervened, and today Kosovo, with many twists and turns, partly because of him though, is semi-independent. It's recognized by a number of countries. But still, I think it is a remarkable movement. It was needed at the time, and it spared Kosovo the scale of bloodshed, at least, that other countries in the Balkans, such as Bosnia especially, but even Croatia, was subjected to. Here the figures were as bad as they were in the low thousands rather than tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. And as even his opponents grudgingly gave him the credit for that, they said, look, he was the right person at the right time. Of all the leaders of former Yugoslavia, Rugova played perhaps the shrewdest game. It achieved a lot, it saved lives, and kept us in our homes. So, even here he achieved a lot, became a president of independent or semi-independent Kosovo, died in 2006, and still is revered in Kosovo as somebody who helped lead them to independence. This is an example that you all may know of. 2 years ago, Ahmadinejad tried to steal an election, 2009. In response, the Green movement sprang up to protest, to come out into the streets. Remarkable movement, gained a lot of attention in the West. Remarkable to us and for my book also, because here was an example of Islam being used both by the regime in a horribly repressive way and by these people in a liberatory way. They adopted Islam. The Green movement is, green being the color of Islam, it's not a coincidence. And they used Islam in just an absolutely incredible way to resist the autocracy of Ahmadinejad. Haven't yet, of course, become successful, as you all may know, but still are keeping at it. I had a very pessimistic ending to my chapter that they seem to be done with. Not at all. And we'll get to the Arab movements in a bit, but taking inspiration from those, they came back early this year. Tens of thousands came out in the streets, showed that they still have life, they still are able to function. Iraq had a small non-violent resistance movement to the US occupation, comprised of women's groups, labor groups, all these groups coming together, was able to persevere in spite of attacks by both sides, the US occupation forces as well as militants. There have been earlier instances in Middle East history. I cite these multiple instances in my book. The most remarkable example, which is still ongoing though, is in Israel-Palestine. This is the most recent iteration of that. However, the first intifada started in the late 1980s. Intifada meaning uprising or shaking off, and went on through the early 90s, nearly completely a non-violent movement. Not a single Israeli soldier was killed in the first year of the uprising. Stone throwing. Now what is stone throwing? There's a debate among scholars of non-violence. Is stone throwing violent? Non-violent? I mean, it's hard to know, but it's in that sort of grey area. So there was stone throwing, and sadly some violence done to people, Palestinians collaborating or seen to be collaborating with the occupation forces. However, toward the Israelis, it was almost completely non-violent. It shook Israeli society in a way that the PLO had been able to before. Islam, again, here was used in a number of ways. Mosques were used to mobilize people. Islam was used to inspire people. They used a range of tactics from tax resistance, boycotts, hunger strikes, formed a number of committees. Women were prominent, workers were prominent. In the end, the Israelis had to give in. It divided Israeli society so sharply, they were forced to come to the negotiating table. The first Oslo Accords, you all may remember in '93, that photo of Clinton looking on and beaming while Rabin and Arafat are shaking hands, was a direct result of the first Intifada. And what happened though is that the Accords did not fulfill their objectives. Israel-Palestine, as we all know, is still in a state of contention. The second Intifada, unfortunately, was much more violent and involved a lot of bombings, suicide bombings. However, even in this, there has been a strand that has been remarkably non-violent against the Israel-Palestine separation barrier, which has been purposely, if I may say so, to encroach on Palestinian land again and again. As a result, in a number of places in Palestine, villages of Bilin, Budrus, and many others, these movements have sprang up, and they have been so remarkably non-violent, again some stone throwing, but so non-violent that Jimmy Carter, Desmond Tutu, Rajmohan Gandhi, the Mahatma's grandson, have all gone there and demonstrated with them to show and shown their support. They have had partial success. Some of the land has been given back. They still are struggling in some other places. There's an Oscar-winning documentary out which deals with the village of Budrus. Oscar-winning, it's not Oscar-winning, Oscar-nominated last year, and it's called Budrus. And in a number of places all around Palestine, these movements have been going on to date, and it's quite a remarkable saga over the last 20 years. Again, not my friends from South Asia, but can anyone else recognize either of these two? They're not as well known. So that's Iftikhar Chaudhry, the current Chief Justice of Pakistan. That is Aizaz Ahsan, a lawyer in Pakistan. Why is it important? Because they just did a remarkable achievement of overthrowing a long ensconced dictator, the US-backed General Pervez Musharraf, and coming out in the streets again after that. Twice they managed to achieve victory. So in a couple of years ago, in the mid-2000s, Pervez Musharraf basically decided to get rid of Iftikhar Chaudhry. He was asking too many questions about too many issues, and Musharraf thought that he would in the end go after him and his legitimacy. So basically one day decided, hey, you're out. And in response, this remarkable lawyers movement came up, which went out in the streets in the face of immense repression. In a single day in Karachi, 40 people or so were killed. What Musharraf did was let his allies run roughshod, kill these people. There was a bomb blast also in another instance. There was a state of emergency declared. In the end, though, these guys proved to be too much for him. And through a chain of events, Musharraf had to leave. He's now in England, basically enjoying comfortable exile. And a major part of this, there were confluence of factors that led to his leaving office, but do not please tell me that these guys didn't have the major role to play. Iftikhar Chaudhry is now the Chief Justice of Pakistan. The current President Zardari also hemmed and hawed about reinstating him because he was afraid that Chaudhry would go after him on corruption charges. They came out in the streets again 2 years ago and again forced Zardari to back down. And as a result, as I said, Chaudhry is currently the Chief Justice of Pakistan. So here you have one of the largest Muslim countries in the world, a remarkable, very recent case of peaceful protest against a dictator. This is less known, Maldives. I don't know how many of you know about the Maldives. Remarkably pretty Indian Ocean island nation, tourist destination. The person who ruled there, Gayoom, and I don't want to have a picture of him because, as my wife Deepa said, if I started having pictures of all the people ousted, I would have to have a rogues gallery of all these dictators. So I don't have a photograph of him. He ruled for 30 years, longest ruling dictator in Asia, excepting maybe, well, even the Middle East. When he was there, I don't think there was anybody from the Middle East who had ruled as long. Ruled till 2008, until he was ousted by a large democratic movement in the country, using Islam, using non-violent creative protest, and as a result they had the first democratic government in their history, and their new president is Mohammad Nasheed. Nasheed came to power, and in a remarkable life history, he let me read this to you from Himal. June 1990, after 18 months in solitary confinement, a political prisoner was finally sentenced to a jail term of 3.5 years. By the time the sentence was handed down, the damage caused by the regular torture he had endured had become overwhelming. His backbone was damaged. He was suffering from internal bleeding. November 2008, standing before the Chief Justice of Maldives, was that very writer and activist ready to be sworn in as the President of Maldives. I mean, incredible story, really. And he's the President of Maldives, is very active on the global warming front. He's been President now for 2.5 years. And Nasheed, after coming to power, in the most forgiving and expansive way said, Islam teaches you there is no future if we hate. When asked how his government would treat Gayoom, the embittered and revengeful cannot become agents of change. And when asked what he would do with the prison system, he said, don't forget, I was a prisoner myself. So, I mean, tortured, Amnesty International Prisoner of the Year, and comes to power. Just a remarkable story. Not as well known in the West because, Maldives is a comparatively quite a small country, among the smallest in South Asia also. But still, an overwhelmingly Muslim nation in which this happened, and something I think that deserves to be known in the West.
It might become inundated too.
You're right, yeah, absolutely. So that's why he's in the forefront of the fight against global warming. We come then to where we are now, which is basically the Middle East. Just a remarkable saga of what's been happening. As I said, two dictators, Zine bin Abidin Ben Ali and Hosni Mubarak, have been ousted in Tunisia and in Egypt. The Egyptian case has especially been well covered. The most important Arab country, I would say, certainly the most populous, has a place in the Western imagination, perhaps because of the pyramids, etc., or whatever it is. But Egypt is something that really has caught the public's eye in the United States also. Perhaps not enough, but still, there has been some change in the discourse about the Middle East. So two successful instances. I would urge people not to be pessimistic. There have been all these stories about how fundamentalists are going to take over. It's still something that's in the making, in the works, but I am Myself, I'm quite optimistic. There are elections scheduled in both these countries. We should wait and watch. Another Muslim country about which they said the same negative things, Indonesia, is now very much a democracy. The fundamentalists have not taken over. I know it's a different region of the world, of course, but the same things were said about Indonesia in '98. It's a flawed country. All democracies are not, and no democracy in the world is perfect, but well on its way to becoming a full-fledged democracy. I would urge people to have patience for Egypt, for Tunisia, and I'm optimistic about Syria, Bahrain, and so many other countries that all of this is happening. I think many of them will change. There's almost not a single country that has been not affected. I mean, it's truly a remarkable confluence of events since the end of 2008, start of 2011. For people who think that Islam has no role in this, Islam is so deeply rooted in people's consciousness. There was a good article in this publication Z which said, look, from social solidarity to suffering, to forbearance, to group activities. I mean, Islam has an impact on people in these countries when they do any of these activities. It's there in the subconscious, and to say, just because they're saying, we are not necessarily explicitly, they're not citing the Quran or Islamic sources, to say that there's an absence of Muslim influence in such deeply Muslim societies is, I think, sort of, not recognizing the truth about what's happening out there. I'm very confident, very optimistic we'll see a completely changed Middle East within a couple of years. Everybody is calling for democracy. It's just been absolutely remarkable, I think, in the last 6 to 8 months. And all of this started with one person in so much in contrast to what we have, the image of Islam, image of Muslims, suicide bombings, this time inflicting the pain just upon himself, only on himself, as an act of protest against the socio-economic conditions he was in. And he could never have imagined the resonance he would have. I mean, I think if Mohammad Bouazizi, that was his name, had lived, he would have been absolutely amazed. An unemployed fruit and vegetable vendor in Tunisia changed Tunisia, Egypt, and the Middle East forever. Really, regardless of what happens there, in the months and years to come. There's a poem in his honor written by an Egyptian poet I'd like to end with. What is to give light? What is to give light must endure. Burning, a man once said. Another man became the matchstick that set a nation aflame. But fire and its appetite cannot be calculated like freedom. Injustice and desperation make men combustible like dry wood. When words lose meaning and an entire people their voice, so they can neither laugh nor scream, death and life begin to taste the same. From Tunis to Egypt to Lebanon to Yemen, the light from a burning man proved catching, and those with nothing to lose or offer but bodies fanned the embers of their hopes into a blazing dream. And I think, really, I mean, it's just remarkable what one person did. Of course, there were so many factors that went into what's been happening in the Middle East, but I'm so happy that my book, as I say, has become so topical, and I'd like to sort of update this book and do maybe in the paperback edition or revised edition, incorporate what's happening in the last 6 to 8 months. But for background on what's been happening currently in the Middle East and so many other instances, this book is a primer for non-violence in Muslim societies and in the Middle East, and I would urge you all to take a look at my book. Thank you so much. Any questions?
Okay, I think in my observation, any religion, if you take it too seriously, you're going to have problems and extremists. I think that's true with Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Mormons. but I mean, I think it's universal to all these religions that if you just follow them too literally and too seriously at the expense of everything else, that's where you're going to have the problem.
Yes, if I may cite my own religion, the Gita, the holy book, was actually as a discourse on a battlefield. Now, if you follow it literally, it actually is a call for war or justification for war. Now, what's happened is that Gandhi and all these progressive sort of reformers reinterpreted it allegorically, which is how a lot of Indians, I think, today sort of follow the Gita, not literally, but you can do it that way and sort of and just use it as a justification for war. So you're absolutely excuse me, you're absolutely right that any religion taken too literally and followed too rigidly can lead to problems. Absolutely. Yeah.
I really appreciated your presentation tonight.
Oh, thank you.
I must say that I'm not totally optimistic about some of the same things that you are. You mentioned Sufism a great deal. You did not mention Wahhabism, which certainly has a great influence in Egypt. And also, you didn't mention the word fatwa. And I've tried to read Solomon Rushdie,
Yeah.
but couldn't get through it all yet.
Yeah. Wahhabi Islam. Now, my book deals, no, it's not a book on Islam per se. So, no, but Wahhabi Islam, I agree. I've written in the past about the official Saudi variant of Islam, which even I have problems with. And you're right, being sort of just endowed with so much oil money, they've been able to spread that variant of Islam in a number of countries in South Asia and the Middle East, much to the detriment, in my honest opinion, of Islam. In Egypt, definitely it has a presence. How much of a presence among the population, how much of a hold, I guess we'll know in the months and years to come when there are democratic elections and we come to know the popular will. Fatwa is basically just an edict, actually. And Islam being, interestingly, democratic in that sense, any mullah or sort of, imam can issue a fatwa, which is just an edict on anything, basically. It can be on any social or political sort of aspect, and doesn't necessarily have to deal with peace or violence or whatsoever. It can be fairly trivial things too. So, but no, I'm not dealt with the notion of fatwa, I guess, in my book. Certainly with the notion of jihad. Yes?
I think that every Western religion seems to have problems between their progressives, maybe, and their orthodox.
Yes.
And in Islam, what do you think are the roadblocks between those who practice an orthodox version of Islam versus those who practice some of the more pacifistic movements or the more progressive side?
Well, as I mentioned in my previous answer, one is official backing of the more regressive sort of variants of Islam. And certainly the most obvious example would be Wahhabi Islam and the Saudi backing of that. It's spread into other countries where it has come into conflict, for example, in Indonesia, in other places. So that would be a major roadblock and obstacle, definitely, if not the major roadblock. That the official, not just Saudi, but in other countries too, that the official sort of discourse on Islam being not necessarily conducive to a pacifist or a progressive interpretation of Islam.
So it's the official acceptance or the official promotion.
Promotion, acceptance, or tolerance, absolutely, yeah. Yes.
Another translation I've heard for the word Islam is submission. I don't know enough about Arabic to know what the various implications or what is the exact translation of the word?
The problem is and here I'm not an Arabic speaker myself. From what I've researched, Islam, the root word can mean submission, deliverance, peace. The various variants of that, and so it's either submission to peace or peace through the submission to the will of God. Again, there are various interpretations. And there is no single answer to that. I wish I knew. I don't think even scholars sort of completely agree on a single interpretation of what the word Islam literally means. You can interpret it to mean peace, as say Gandhi did, or you can interpret it in a different way. Yeah. Yes.
I think of Sufism which is a lot of what you seem to be referring to in
Yeah.
Islam, as a very special part of the Muslim tradition, and a very mystical one. And I believe that from my study of different religions that the mystical branches of most religions are such as you describe Sufism, peace-loving, very heartful, and pretty universal. They believe mostly the same sorts of things. And I know that in my own tradition, that the mystics are a very small percentage of us. I'm wondering if you can take a guess at what percentage of Muslims you think
I try to answer that. So, okay, so formally, very few. However, the practices of a lot of Muslims are imbued and informed by Sufi Islam in South Asia and Southeast Asia, the Balkans, Turkey, all these places. Sufism has a large presence. North Africa, I would say, with perhaps the singular exception of the Persian Gulf region, where I have not found it to have, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. There is a strong presence, and in a lot of the practices, such as these shrines, believing in these saints. So one would think and hope that with the saints, their beliefs would also come into the idea and notion of Islam too. For many Muslims it does, for many it doesn't. But you're right, formally, very few Muslims identify themselves as Sufi Muslims, because it's seen, again, even among Muslims as this almost groovy, hippie-ish type, type cult, yeah. Yes. Hello.
I'm an American Muslim. I was born in Monroe, Wisconsin, and was raised in Broadwood, Wisconsin, and became Muslim in 1995. And I can't help but be encouraged by people as yourself and what you're trying to do, because being Muslim for 16 years, prior to September 11, I've always had a concern that something might happen because of some of the elements in the community, as many religious communities like the KKK among Christians, the Tamil Tigers in Southeast Asia. So that something might happen, and that might change the view of some or many Americans. And I'm very interested in the statistics that I've read your article in the Wisconsin State Journal, and some of the views that Americans have about who aren't Muslim, non-Muslim Americans. And I think that I just want to thank you again for your efforts and what you've done for the Muslim community as a non-Muslim. I think more of us need to come together, whether we're atheist or Christian or Hindu or whatever faith, whatever belief, to try to, I think we can meet on common goals and try to establish something, work towards goals we may not believe have come together on foundational beliefs or practices, but I think there are things that we can come together on. And one of those things, I read a quote once about words make worlds. And one of the things that I read in USA Today article about General Petraeus, who has now been assigned as the director of the CIA, he continued to use throughout his term the word Islamic terrorism. There's no such thing as terrorism in Islam, as you've pointed out. And I thought that was unfortunate when I read that he continued to use that throughout his term. And one of the things that you used, the term that you used, was fundamentalism. And I think that's kind of a tricky word when it comes to Islam or any religion, because somebody might look at me and say, wow, he's pretty strict or fundamental. And whereas radical, I think probably a radical person like the KKK or the Tamil Tigers or Al-Qaeda or some of the terrorist individuals or groups would probably be more appropriate. So I don't know what you think of that in terminology and how it affects people and thinking.
Thanks for your compliment. As I mentioned in my book, I went to college and early part of my school in Lucknow, which is the capital of the largest state in India. And actually our neighborhood was kind of a microcosm. We had Hindu neighbors on one side, Christian neighbors on the other, and just across the path was a Muslim landlord and he used to send us all these nice dishes during Ramzan, and so probably that did the trick. so yeah, he was really this old-fashioned. You have to meet these guys. He was quite a character, and unless you know how these landlords are, Hindu or Muslim in India, it'd be hard to sort of get an image of him. But so no, you're right about terminology. In fact, for example, Hindus say that they can't be Hindu fundamentalists because there are no fundamentalists in Hinduism. So it's tricky. I must admit, and maybe I'm using the words and the terms loosely without paying enough attention, and I should be, perhaps a bit more careful. Yeah. Yes.
Are you aware there's a group somewhere? I attended a talk in Janesville, Wisconsin, where a Muslim imam, a Christian priest, and a Jewish rabbi each spoke of their religions and invited questions.
Yes, I'm quite aware of the group. In fact, one of the people who's participating in that locally is Phil Haslinger, if I may say so, a friend of mine. He is half-time a journalist and half-time a pastor with the Unitarian Church, and he's wonderful in all holding all these interfaith sort of initiatives and dialogues locally, and so I'm quite aware. In fact, I think he wrote about this very recently in his column, in his religion affairs column for the Cap Times.
Actually, it's UCC, United Church of Christ.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I stand corrected. Yeah. Any other questions, or should we? Well, thank you all for coming.